Well, in the big picture, everybody asks questions about where we are in the universe, how we fit in, where we came from, where we're going.
Why am I here? What's this all about?
You're not human if you don't ask these kind of questions.
Either the universe came from nothing or from some other universe, or it was created.
To buy into the Big Bang, you have to sell out in Genesis chapter 1 and 2.
If we're just glorified goo, then there's not much meaning to that. Conversely, if we were created specifically in the image of God, then that has major implications for each of us.
The stars, the universe, our solar system. Where did it come from and why are we here? These are topics that stir the imagination. Were we created by God, or did we evolve over millions of years through slow and gradual processes? Can we know for sure?
Well, in the big picture, everybody asks questions about where we are in the universe, how big the universe is, how we fit in, where we came from, where we're going.
Why am I here? What's this all about? And why didn't anyone give me instructions?
You're not human if you don't ask these kind of questions about the ultimate destiny, origin of the universe and origin of ourselves.
I think probably everyone has feelings like that, especially as a child.
We get a lot of our ideas from the ancient Greeks. We really trace our lineage of history, of science back to them, and since much of their science dealt with astronomy, the history of astronomy is really rich in this sort of thing. And many of them believed in the eternality of the universe. They thought the universe had always existed. Now, I think that there are really a couple of reasons for that. One of them, they couldn't conceive of a natural or physical way that the universe could come into existence by itself. And the other thing was the fact that they didn't have sufficient gods that could do this. Their gods were not much more than Superman. You know, you had Zeus and others, and they really had foibles like humans did. They were born, they could die. They were not transcendent gods, so they weren't creator gods. They were bound by the creation, just as humanity is bound by the creation. It's interesting to me that that idea of the eternality of the universe persisted well into the 20th century.
And that really was the common view up until about the time of Tycho, 1500s, 1600s, around there, when people started to recognize that things like comets, which they used to think were atmospheric phenomena, they used to think those were part of Earth's atmosphere, they realized those are in space and the universe really can change.
Astronomy took a giant step forward in the 1600s and 1700s with scientists who believed in the Bible. Men like Galileo, Newton, Kepler, Bacon, and Pascal held to the belief that the universe was created by God, as presented in the book of Genesis. They believed God wanted them to discover His creation. Science was taken to new heights because of their biblical worldview. But their leadership didn't last long. A sinister plan was laid out to strip God from the credit of His creation.
The Enlightenment, they decided that man was the measure, man was important, and they went and took a look at the things that people had done in science in the previous century and even in the 18th century, and sort of claimed it as their own. It was a philosophical point. It was not actually even scientific. They hijacked it from start to finish, took it away from its biblical foundation, and we're still recovering from that. We went from a situation where God was welcome, not only was welcome, but he was central, to the point now that God is very unwelcome in the science that we do.
It wasn't really, though, until the 1920s when astronomers discovered that galaxies are all moving away from each other. The universe appears to be expanding. That demolished the ancient view that the universe was eternal and static and unchanging. In a way, it confirms Scripture. The Bible talks about this expansion of the universe in places like Isaiah 40:22, where it talks about God stretching out the heavens as a tent. And so that just demolished these ancient ideas of an eternal and unchanging universe.
But the discovery of the expansion of the universe didn't draw people back to the Creator God, but instead spawned new naturalistic ideas.
It's interesting, in my lifetime, the theories of the origin of the universe have changed quite a bit. When I was very young, there were two dominant ideas, what we call the Big Bang cosmology. We should say Big Bang cosmogony, but everybody uses the word cosmology instead. And the other one was what we call the steady state.
The science media will say all scientists believe the Big Bang. Well, that's not true. Number one, many scientists are Christians who don't accept the Big Bang. Even among non-Christian scientists, there are alternatives within the Big Bang. There are different versions of it. And there are also those who reject the Big Bang completely and propose alternate cosmologies.
The Big Bang Theory, it's very elegant. It does have unanswered questions, but it's very intellectually satisfying to many astronomers.
The idea was the universe began in an ultra-dense, ultra-hot state, and now they'd say 13.8 billion years ago, as of last week, week before, I think. It's been expanding ever since, and cooling, and out of this came everything. There are a few renegades out there who believe in a modified steady-state model. That's sort of been taken over by people who believe in plasma, what we call plasma universe or plasma cosmology. Then we have recent creationists, and myself included, who believe in the Bible. We believe the creation was a few thousand years ago, not billions of years ago. And right away we run into problems with the Big Bang because it's billions of years ago, and you have the Earth existing, coming into being about 9 billion years into the process, kind of a Johnny-come-lately. There are a host of problems between the biblical account of creation and the Big Bang.
To buy into the Big Bang, you have to sell out in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. You have to say that that story is just a story and is metaphor or non-reality.
Recent creationists, as myself, generally reject the Big Bang in favor of a recent creation model. It's kind of like a singularity. The Big Bang is a singularity, but we think the beginning of the universe probably was too. It's just much more recent.
Either the universe came from nothing or from some other universe, or it was created by God. Those really are the only two logical possibilities. How do we evaluate which of these two is correct? One way is we could examine the logical consequences of those two views. In a naturalistic worldview, certain logical consequences follow from that. If biblical creation is true, certain logical consequences follow from that. And my argument for the Bible has always been that only the biblical worldview, one where God has created the universe, can make sense of those things that we take for granted, like the basic reliability of our senses, or the fact that the universe has an orderliness to it. That makes sense if God upholds it by the word of His power. If, on the other hand, the universe is a cosmic accident, why would there be laws of nature? Why would they obey nice, neat little equations like E equals mc squared and F equals ma and so on? We take those things for granted, but only in a creation worldview would those things make sense. The creation worldview is demonstrated to be true because if it weren't, you couldn't prove that anything is true.
But we believe the Earth was created at the very beginning and did not come about after a long process in the universe. Our viewpoint differs very radically from what many scientists believe today.
Creationists, most of them have been evolutionists, just like I was. I was an atheist, an evolutionist, and I believed in the billions of years that were alleged for the age of the world. When I became a creationist, I was convinced by the scientific evidence that there was no evolution and billions of years didn't happen. So I changed glasses, I changed worldviews. So most creationists are like that. They have seen the world through at least two pairs of glasses. And so creationists are much more conscious of how worldview affects your interpretation. Creationists know how evolutionists think, having been that way ourselves, but most evolutionists don't really understand how creationists think.
I would argue that the Christian worldview alone is the only philosophy that is self-consistent and will make knowledge possible. Any other philosophy ultimately will lead to contradictions. It will end up refuting itself. And that's something the Bible tells us in Proverbs 1:7. It says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." The scriptures make clear you either start with biblical presuppositions, a God-honoring biblical worldview, or you're reduced to foolishness.
I take as one of my primary assumptions that God exists, that He's real, that He's revealed Himself through His Word to us, the Bible.
The Christian worldview can make sense of those assumptions. Of course my senses are going to be basically reliable if God created them. Of course that makes sense. On the other hand, evolution cannot make sense of those basic assumptions that we all take for granted. If evolution were true, then why would my senses be basically reliable? If they're just the results of, rearranged pond scum, why would we expect them to be reliable? And so the Christian worldview can make sense of those basic, what we call presuppositions, your most basic assumptions about reality, and secular worldviews really can't.
Evolutionists, most of them, have only seen the world through evolutionary glasses. Every scientist does this. You establish a set of worldviews about how you think things work and have worked and how we got here. And then you try to funnel all the data you get into that framework. The evolutionist is not conscious most of the time that he is viewing the world this way, that his worldview is shaping how he interprets data. And if you have data that doesn't fit the worldview very much, you kind of push it aside. If you assume that the universe has been here a very long time, then you're going to be interpreting evidence in that way. You'll assume that all fossil layers were laid down at today's very slow rate. And so you'll look at the Grand Canyon and see miles of fossil layers, and you'll say, well, that took a long time to deposit. Of course, nothing like the Genesis flood could have deposited them. So the worldview assumption that the Earth is very old shapes one's view about how the layers in the Grand Canyon got deposited.
Choosing between the two is not simply a matter of looking at data and saying, where does the evidence go? Because there's spiritual implications. We are at heart all sinners, and we are rebellious against our Creator. I fought that for a long time, even though I saw data, I saw science. No, because of where it leads to. It leads to me having accountability. But I think a lot of the rejection of Christianity comes from that. There's an atheist philosopher, I think it was Nagel, who mentioned something along the lines of, I don't want the universe to be that way. So that sort of sums it all up.
The difficulty in deciding what happened in the past is you're not able to directly observe this. We frequently make this distinction between what we call operational science and historical science. The evolutionists don't like that, but it's okay. It's still a valid thing to point out.
And astronomy is difficult because we can't bring things into the laboratory and do experiments. I mean, you can't bring a star into your lab bench and play with it. There's also, with few exceptions, we haven't visited these objects either. We visited a few planets with a few spacecraft, and that's about it. So for the most part, we're taking pictures of objects from very far away and trying to figure out, A, what they're doing today, and B, what they were like in the past.
There's a scripture in Ecclesiastes that Gerald Arjma used to like to quote. What has happened is remote and exceedingly distant. Who can understand it? We are talking about things that we can't lay hold of. We don't have a nice time machine. We can't go back and see what happened and record what happened. So we have to look at the evidence left by all the events that happened, and there are different ways to interpret that evidence, and your presuppositions get into that interpretation very strongly.
So there's assumptions you have to make in order to do that. And part of the difficulty is that in a lot of these cases, there's a lot of possible past scenarios that would still produce the same result we see today. How do you know which of those past scenarios is correct? We have to make a lot of assumptions in order to do that, and there's no way to verify those assumptions. Your assumptions might be wrong, your conclusions might be wrong. How do you know? They all produce the same effect, which is what we see in space today.
Many times people say, well, disbelieving evolution is like disbelieving gravity. We can test any theory of gravity. In fact, general theory of relativity is being tested all the time in all sorts of experiments and doing quite well with that, thank you. If somebody comes up with an alternate, say, I don't believe the theory of gravity we have, here's a better theory, then we can build a piece of equipment, we can go into a lab, we can put something, spacecraft in orbit, whatever we do. We can do some sort of experiment to test this. Creation or evolution, that is a past process. How can you devise an experiment in the here and now that will allow you to find out what happened in the past to things like, for instance, dinosaurs? What happened to them? That's a past process. Sort of like forensic science. You can never totally recreate a crime scene, no matter how careful you are. Furthermore, who's to say that some other sort of explanation could suffice? That's the whole point of a criminal case, a trial many times, is that you've got the prosecution spinning one theory to explain all the details, and you've got the defense putting forth a different theory. And they both cannot be true. They both could be false, but they both can't be true simultaneously. And we're dealing with a past process. And there are many situations where people found out later that their interpretation of past processes, be in science or be in forensics, has been wrong. And so the standards of proof are not the same when you're talking about past processes and current processes. The way I like to illustrate this is with the late Carl Sagan. Over 30 years ago, he had a popular TV series on PBS, at that point the most popular, and for a number of years afterwards it was. And he had a statement very early on in that, in the book and in the video series. The universe is all there ever has been, and all there ever will be. And many people hearing that or reading that say, wow, what a profound scientific statement. There's not a bit of science in this. He's asserted three things. What the universe is all that there is right now. It's a denial of a spiritual reality. It's a denial that God exists. He can't prove that, but it's what it is. Then he said that it's all the universe that ever has existed. That means God has never existed, or nothing outside of the natural or physical world has existed in the past. And it's all ever will exist. It's an assertion that the natural world is all there is and all ever will be. Well, how could Carl Sagan know that with any certainty? Well, he'd have to be able to step outside of the world and look and see that there's nothing outside of the world. He'd have to also not only do it now, but every time in the past and every time in the future. Well, obviously he couldn't do that, because to do that you'd have to be God, which he has assumed doesn't exist. So it's an assertion of his worldview. There's no science in it. That's fine, as long as you recognize it's his worldview. And that's the kind of thing totally opposite of what I'm talking about. He starts with that worldview, and so if he concludes that God doesn't exist, I'm not surprised, because he assumed to start out that God did not exist. He said, I don't see any evidence there, proof that God exists. Well, of course not. You're not looking at it properly. You've also decided that science is only dealing with the physical world, which it is, but if you don't believe the supernatural world exists, the spiritual world, then why would you expect to see physical, natural evidence of that beyond those things? You make that assumption and you end up with a certain set of conclusions because of the assumptions that you've made. And it's very tough to get outside of either one of those boxes and view the world differently.
Finding out how the universe was created is a challenge. We've seen how our worldview influences how we look at the data. But the observable evidence, like the stars, the planets, and the laws of physics, should be able to tell us, right? Does it show a universe created by chance or one by design?
I think there are things in the universe we see that can tell us about our origins. One thing I like to talk about is the first and second law of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics is a conservation principle that there's no more energy being made. Energy is neither created nor is it destroyed. We used to have the conservation of mass. We still talk about that. Same sort of thing. The matter can neither be created nor destroyed. Now, we've discovered in the past century that that's not quite true, because as Albert Einstein argued, I think in 1905, energy and mass are equivalent things. E equals mc squared gives you the equivalence there. So to modify that today, we would say that the total mass energy of the universe remains constant, neither created nor destroyed. Having clarified that, that would seem to rule out that the universe could have come into existence by itself. If you suddenly have the appearance of matter and energy, that would seem to violate the first law of thermodynamics, which is a very fundamental thing we see about the universe. But the second law has an interesting thing to say. It says the amount of usable energy out there is always diminishing. We have different ways of expressing it. By the way, the second law is a very slippery concept. Just when I think I've got a hold of it, I get mugged by something I didn't really realize before. But you can state it a number of different ways. One of the statements, again, is the usable energy gets less and less. The energy gets dispersed and less available to us. We call this entropy, and entropy is increasing. That's a measure of how much unusable energy there is or how much disorder there is in the universe. If you extrapolate that into the past, you'll find out that the universe in the past must have been very ordered. The energy must have been very useful. And if you go back and back and back into the past, you have a problem because you reach a point of infinite order and infinite usefulness, which doesn't exist today. So there's been a change from that. And how did it ever get started? So the first law by itself seems to suggest the universe did not have a beginning. And the second law argues that it must have had a beginning. So you got these two very fundamental laws that seem to be universal that have this tremendous amount of tension. Both are true, but ultimately in the past, they couldn't have both been operating as they are today. And to me, that tells me there's an interruption of the way the world normally works. We have this world that seems to have universal law that seems to govern it. That would be the upholding of the world by the power of God's Word. I believe that we're seeing the manifestation there. But ultimately, the two laws, when taken together, seem to indicate very strongly that the universe had a non-physical, non-natural sort of origin. And I think that argues very strongly for something, how the world came to be, that we will never be able to probe because it would violate physical principles to do that. And that, to me, indicates a supernatural origin.
There are various lines of evidence in the universe that lend themselves very naturally to a creation interpretation and are really sticking points for those who believe in a naturalistic origin for the universe. Some of those, for example, would be, how do you make a star? My secular colleagues believe that stars form from nebulae, which is a large cloud of hydrogen and helium gas made of the same stuff as stars. And so they say, well, maybe that's where stars come from. The idea is the nebula is supposed to collapse in on itself and form a star. But the problem is the gas pressure in a nebula tends to resist any compression. Now there is gravity pulling in on it, but in a typical region of space, the force of gas pressure in a nebula is much larger than the force of gravity. And so I'm very skeptical that a nebula could ever collapse to form a star. And so if stars cannot form naturalistically, and we do have them, they had to have been created supernaturally.
It's difficult to figure out what happened in the past because the only observations we can make are here in the present. We do have methods for determining things in the past. They're historical methods, not scientific methods. But that generally applies to things that happened on Earth for which we have eyewitness accounts, testimony, written records, that sort of thing. None of that is obviously available to us when you're talking about astronomy. We look in the solar system, there's planets. That doesn't tell us how they used to be or what they used to look like or whatever. All we can see is the ones we have today. Now we can construct models and say, well, maybe they were like this in the past, but how do you verify that one of those models is true? I mean, if you think about it, there's an infinite number of stories you can create, each of which has the planet Jupiter in its current orbit today at the end of the story. How do you distinguish among all those various, infinite permutations? Well, you can't. There's arbitrary choices people tend to make, and they'll say, well, this has been verified with a computer simulation. Well, again, there's an infinite number of computer simulations you can have. And today, in secular circles, as an example, to solve certain problems in the solar system, people are positing that the various planets all used to be in different places, and then they all moved around, and they slingshot this one through, this one out here, and there used to be other planets that are no longer there anymore. How do you verify that there used to be a planet somewhere where that planet no longer exists? I mean, the evidence for this model is that the planet doesn't exist anymore, you don't see it. There are few places in science where you can say, the fact that I don't see something is evidence that it used to exist. But that's the ultimate implication of a lot of the models that are being portrayed nowadays.
Different models of origins, different models of the structure of the universe make different predictions about what we should see as we look deeper and deeper out into space. The Big Bang model had predicted that we should start to see galaxies just starting to form. They would say as you look out in space, you're looking back in time, is the way they like to think of it. That's not really true, but that's a can of worms there. But in any case, they would say, therefore, when you look back out into space, you're looking back closer to the Big Bang, and eventually you should see galaxies just starting to form. That's not what we see, though. We see galaxies fully formed, fully designed, in many cases spiral galaxies, out at tremendous distances where my secular colleagues were expecting them just to start forming. They're fully designed. And that in itself lends itself to a creation explanation. It makes perfect sense.
And they would expect to see fewer and fewer of what they call the heavy elements. These are anything heavier than helium, say lithium through oxygen, through carbon. They would expect to see fewer and fewer of those because they would have less and less of time for the supernovas to generate those elements. They don't see that. They see about the same abundances of those elements way out there as we do nearby. On the other hand, the creation cosmologies, the ones that I've worked on, would expect to see something like what we're seeing. There's lots and lots of evidence like that. The spectral lines of stars and galaxies. We see evidence of the magnetic fields of stars and galaxies, and those look like a clue that God left behind to help us unravel things.
The late Carl Sagan was fond of saying that we're made of stardust. That was in his Cosmos program. Lawrence Krauss recently, in some of his writings and his talks, have been talking about we're made of stardust. He said, forget Jesus, the stars died for you, is what he's saying. He's being very flippant. It's offensive. It really is.
The idea is there, that's way behind that, is that the Big Bang itself wouldn't produce much more than hydrogen and helium.
And in my body I have carbon, I have nitrogen, I have oxygen. It makes up the bulk of the mass of my body. I also have iron in my blood, I have calcium in my bones, and I have probably most of the other elements in trace amounts, copper, selenium, and different things elsewhere in my body.
The only way they can figure out how to make that is inside a star. And so they say, well, the way all the heavier elements in the universe were produced is when the stars make them and then explode and release those elements into the universe, and the Earth collapsed in allegedly from some of those elements. And so in their view, since we're made of heavier stuff, and since that heavier stuff can only come from a star, we must have been made from star stuff.
It's a wonderful story, but it's a story, it's a creation myth, as it were. You can't prove any of that. It's dressed in some scientific sort of dressing, but it really is a creation myth that people have put together.
I don't think it's satisfying. It doesn't really answer the questions in a comprehensive way, but it is certainly a popular view in our day. And science in our time, I think, has gone off on a tangent and has really bought into that idea of naturalism. And it doesn't have to be that way. Science is the search for truth. And if that leads you to a creator that's behind the universe, then so be it. And I think it does lead clearly that way.
As we look into the origin of the universe, there are several key factors to consider. Is the universe finite? Is there an edge? Does it have a center? Are we at the center? Is the universe curved? These and other questions must be addressed when we discuss the beginning of everything.
When we talk about the universe, we have several terms. We talk about if the universe is infinite or finite. If the universe is finite, that means that theoretically, at least, you could go out there and you could probe space, you could measure, and you say, well, there's so many cubic megaparsecs of space. You can put a number on it. If you put a number on it, then in mathematics and in science, we say that it's finite. If you can't put a number on it, that is, its volume is beyond numbers, we say that it's infinite. Then you have the concept of the universe being bound or being unbound, and a boundary refers to an edge, a border to the thing. and unbound means it would not have a boundary or an edge. This idea the universe just goes on and on and on. If you go out into space and just keep going and going, you'd never exhaust it. And that just doesn't seem right. It just seems weird. But yet, if it ended, well, there'd be kind of a wall or a boundary there, and of course, then what is that wall or boundary? That's a problem. While infinity of the universe bothers me, think of being bound by some sort of wall or package, that seals it off, that's even worse. With what I know about mathematics and about cosmological models, I can kind of have my cake and eat it too. We know with general relativity today that space generally would have a curvature to it. It can have a curvature to it. And so what I imagine the universe is like is that it bends back on itself and folds around. So if I took off in this direction and could travel long enough, I would come back in this direction. Or if I stood around long enough, I could look off in the distance and see the back of my head. Of course, it's a long time for that light from the back of my head to come around, so that's not going to happen. But theoretically, it would be there. And this universe would be finite in size and yet would not have a boundary or an edge, because I'd be able to continue indefinitely around and around the universe if I kept traveling, never reaching an edge. And I like that concept. As far as I'm concerned, the boundary idea refers to the boundary of the space and time of the universe. Time is bound, but I don't think space is bound in the same sense.
In the secular view, there is no center of the universe. A lot of people mistake that. They think that the Big Bang is an explosion in space, away from a center point. But that's not how secular astronomers think of it. They would think of the universe like the surface of a balloon. Imagine drawing a bunch of points on the surface of a balloon, and the balloon expands away. Now, which one of those points is the center? Well, none of them are really. And so likewise, that's how secularists think about this universe. The same way the two-dimensional surface of a balloon is wrapped around an unperceived third dimension, they would say our three-dimensional universe is wrapped around a fourth dimension. You can think of it that way anyway. From a creation point of view, there may very well be a center of the universe.
There is something very interesting that's been around for 35 years. In the mid-70s, a man named Tift began looking at the redshifts of galaxies. And he found out there's some quantization going on. It's not a real hard and fast rule, but there are multiples of redshifts, multiples like 70 kilometers per second, that seem to keep popping up. A bit of histogram, there are bumps along the way here, which you would expect in a Big Bang universe that wouldn't happen. And the easiest interpretation, the simplest interpretation, is that if this is true, is that the universe consists of a bunch of concentric shells of galaxies, and we happen to lie close to the center, not necessarily at the center, but close to the center.
As if galaxies tend to come in these shells with fewer in between these shells, and we're looking into that right now, and it certainly looks that way. One thing that we have to be careful of are what are called selection effects. It could be, for example, that the reason we see these shells is not because they're actually there, but because perhaps it's easier to detect galaxies at certain distances. You have to be very careful of selection effects in science. But assuming those are taken care of, and our initial results have been very positive, it would suggest that our solar system is in a special position near the center of these spherical shells of galaxies, which defies a naturalistic explanation.
And from that evidence, we can say that we're not more than 1 million light years away from the center. Our galaxy might be the center. We're not at the center of our galaxy, but we're out at a much safer place. It's not safe to be at the center of galaxies, where there's usually at least one big black hole spewing out all sorts of radiation. It's cluttered with stars and you can't see very far. So God looks like He perched us out at the optimum distance from the center of our galaxy, so we could see the rest of the universe, not be clobbered by passing stars, and not get radiation from black holes, etc., etc.
If we're very far away from the center, this gets smeared out and we don't see it. And Tift's work since the mid-70s has been largely ignored because the consequences. If Tift is right, then the Big Bang cosmology is finished. I mean, it's done with. I think that's one reason why a lot of recent creationists like it so much. I like it too, but I don't want to try to use it as a nuclear device to try to blow the model up. I think we need to be a little more circumspect, make sure we have a very good case when we do it. Again, it's not a real clear, hard and fast rule, but it's a general enough. I don't think you can explain it away easily.
So there is compelling evidence for a created universe. If this is true, what does the Bible tell us about why the earth and heavens were created, and ultimately, why we were created?
Psalm 19 tells us that the heaven declares the glory of God. And indeed it does. And the further out we look, the more wonders we see, and the more awestruck we are with the size of everything.
You look at the heavens, you can't escape there being a God, it doesn't seem to me.
I love Psalm 19:1. The first 6 verses teach about how the sun, moon, and stars, how they speak metaphorically to us, and that they declare God's glory, and they certainly do. When you look through a telescope, you can't help but be impressed at what God has created. And if you're a Christian, you can't help but worship God for what He's made.
The further out we look, the more wonders we discover. And we're struck by the beauty of it all. But can there be beauty in an atheistic universe? Well, the concept of beauty has no meaning, really. It's just all random stuff that happened to arrange itself a certain way. Conversely, though, we can look at it and say, this is what God is communicating to us. Number one, the power that He has. Omnipotence, of course, is the usual theological description, that He can create all this instantaneously. Genesis says He made the stars also when describing the creation account, almost as if it was an afterthought. That the God who could create this is, oh, by the way, zip, there's everything else too.
So I view the universe as being a giant billboard and put up in those LED lights, as it were. God is advertising to us the fact that there is a creator, so that we are without excuse. As the book of Romans tells us, there is enough information given to us. The world screams out that there must be a creator.
When a person looks up, God has hardwired that person to recognize that this was made by God. Romans 1 tells us that God has made Himself known to everyone. He's shown it to us. He's hardwired us so that when we look out and see all the beauty in the world out there, we recognize that God created it. Now, of course, there's ugliness in the world too. The Bible tells us that the world we live in today is not the way it was originally created by God. It's been cursed. And so it's only, again, the Christian position that can explain why we have such beauty in the world and also such ugliness. But on the other hand, if evolution were true, hey, it's all just sound and fury signifying nothing.
It's not sufficient to bring a man to salvation, but it's enough to get him to start looking elsewhere for answers that science and the physical world cannot tell you. That's the whole purpose, I think, of the world around us, to bring His glory and honor to God.
Is there a point to the universe? Is there meaning for our existence? There's very different answers to that question, whether you're a Christian or not.
If we're no more than the sum of our parts, we're just physical beings and there's no spiritual component to us, in the grand scheme of things, if we're gone, what does it matter?
If there's no God, there is no meaning to life. You can make up your own meaning, but it's artificial. You could say, my purpose is to stack as many cups as high as I can. And who's to say that that's a wrong purpose, right? If your life is to have any objective meaning, any objective value, that's only going to work in the Christian worldview, where God has made us, He's made us in His image, He's told us what He wants us to do, and we're to glorify Him in what we do. That's our purpose, is to enjoy God forever and to glorify Him, as He said in His Word.
If we're just glorified goo, then there's not much meaning to that. Conversely, if we were created specifically in the image of God, by God Himself, that imbued us with spirits and souls in His image, and we are meant to do certain things in our lives, and our fate after we die is either to be with Him or not, then that has major implications for each of us.
If I'm gone, is it really going to make a big difference? Well, maybe to a few people for a generation or two, but after a while, who cares anymore? And I find that very unsatisfying, because it's just right now, right here, and that's it. Once you die, it's finished, and who cares what happens to the world?
Well, here we are on this pale blue dot, as Carl Sagan used to like to say, in the vastness of the universe. We're insignificant. We're nothing compared to the universe itself. What does all that mean? Well, many atheists have grappled with this and been very open about what this actually means. Lawrence Krauss, atheist cosmologist, said we're just a bit of pollution in the universe. If you get rid of us, the universe would be largely the same. We're completely irrelevant.
But this is a very good question, actually. His answer's terrible, but the question's good. And I think the psalmist 3,000 years ago asked the same question in Psalm 8. He says, when I look at the stars, the moon, and the things which you've made with your fingers, I ask the question, what is man that you're mindful of him, or the Son of Man? David didn't have powerful telescopes, he didn't have space probes, but he had 2 eyes. He was able to take in quite a bit in a dark sky, which I've done many times at observatories and remote locations, and it's a glorious thing. He looked around, he was stunned by the beauty and majesty and the size of the world around us, and he asked the question, well, what do we matter? Same question Carl Sagan answered. But I like the answer that he had better. It says in Psalm 8, he answers the question. He says, you've made him a little lower than the angels and crowned him with glory and honor and placed all things under his feet. This goes back to the mandate from the garden, that we are put in dominion over the earth, to control the earth and be in charge of it, and be good stewards, by the way, I might add. But ultimately, the fact that we're important comes from the fact that God says we're important, from being created in His image. We're special, we're important. And so we do have a very important role. And if God's real, and I believe that He is, then we will be spending eternity with Him or without Him, and that's very important.
We are at heart all sinners, and we are rebellious against our Creator. As I was. I saw where the science went. I didn't want it to go there. I fought that for a long time, even though I saw data, I saw science. No, because of where it leads to. It leads to me having accountability. It's not hard to understand that that's where it goes. It may be conscious, it may be unconscious. But I think a lot of the rejection of Christianity comes from that.
Well, our lives are very important because we're supposed to bring glory and honor to God, and we have a relationship. He wants to have a relationship with us. And we can only find that through the redemption of His Son, Jesus Christ, by His death, burial, and resurrection, and placing our faith in that and His finished work to make us perfect and righteous before God. It's imputed righteousness, we say, from God. It's the only way we can do it. If you miss that, then nothing else in the world is important. Everything else I've talked about, ever, is unimportant compared to that one message. That gives meaning and purpose, because I believe I will live forever.
Why should God pay attention to us? Well, He does. And not only does He pay attention to us, He loves us enough to have incarnated Himself in the form of His Son, Jesus, to come here and rescue us from ourselves, really, and buy for Himself a bride.
In the Christian worldview, you can have genuine meaning in your life. Now, that's not the only reason to believe it. The reason to believe it is because it's true. But how wonderful that the real universe is one in which we're made with a purpose, and we get to enjoy that purpose. If we receive Christ as our Savior, we get to enjoy that purpose and enjoy God forever.
When you study the origins of the universe, you begin to realize that each worldview has major implications. One brings meaninglessness, and one with great meaning. That you were created with a purpose. Which one will you choose? Until next time, keep looking up and see that the heavens do declare the glory of God.